Okay, this will be the last video looking at taxation reforms, and in this video we're going to look at taxation reforms and some of the other goals, including living standards, as well as some of the weaknesses of taxation reforms. So in terms of tax reforms and strong and sustainable growth, you could talk about lower personal income taxes and how that provides greater incentive, or a greater motivation for individuals to work harder, so that leads to increased productivity, which can help to boost aggregate supply. You could talk about increased labour force participation. Most of this stuff we've talked about in the other videos. You're just linking the broad things and linking it to potentially how they can boost aggregate supply in relation as a whole tax reform. So, can boost labour force participation, can help increase the quantity of our labour resources. So the idea of by boosting the labour force participation, that helps to boost aggregate supply. When you're linking things to aggregate supply, really just think about the quantity and quality of resources. If you think of labour as a resource or capital as a resource, all you need to do is think of, all right, taxation reforms, how do they boost labour productivity, or how do they boost the quantity or quality of our labour, and how do they boost the quantity and quality of our capital when you're answering these questions. So that'll boost productive capacity because there's increased quantity of labour force. Cutting company taxes will boost both domestic and foreign investment, which then can be linked to businesses being more likely to expand, invest in new capital and infrastructure because they get to keep more of their profits, and you can link that to increased technical efficiency in the future because of that increased investment. Getting rid of the carbon tax, and that's called the minerals resource rent tax that's related to. That again has helped to boost company profits and has expanded investment. So you could argue that it's bad for intertemporal efficiency, the lower carbon tax, but getting rid of the carbon tax has helped to reduce businesses' costs of production. Full employment, lower marginal tax rates, increase the incentive to work and get a job. That should help to reduce hardcore unemployment or people being unemployed because of a lack of motivation to work. It should help to boost productivity and reduce businesses' costs of production, so that can be linked to firms becoming more competitive. It can be linked to firms expanding their production. You could also link that to increase international competitiveness and jobs through that. But firms are more likely to expand when they're more productive, when they're more profitable, and when they're getting taxed at a lower rate. Lower company tax rates decrease the amount of business closures because firms are more likely to be able to survive and expand, and that will reduce structural unemployment as well. So you're really linking it to the benefits that investment spending can have in terms of productivity and how that can lead to reduced structural unemployment. Living standards, okay, a lot of these structural reforms are about lowering inflation, so you can link that to purchasing power because people are experiencing lower prices because of the productivity benefits, potentially the lower wages, the investment spending. All of that should lead to increased purchasing power. Tax reforms that boost efficiency can help to negate some of the problems with an ageing population. So if we're more efficient and we get more people into the labour force, the government might be able to keep taxes down because we've got a bigger labour supply, so there's not as much pressure to increase taxes. Should lead to lower unemployment, which will boost general happiness and reduce stress levels and keep crime rates down. If we're stimulating investment spending, the abolition of the carbon tax may hurt the environment, so some of these tax reforms may have negative impacts on the environment. So, for example, the removal of the carbon tax. Tax reforms where we don't target the environmental costs at the right level. So if we were to set the price too low, that can lead to other harmful impacts on our quality of life, which can hurt efficiency. But generally, most of these policies are benefiting living standards through lower prices, through increased productivity, through the jobs that they create in the long term. In terms of weaknesses of taxation reforms, some of the things I'll be focusing on, and I'll be elaborating on these points, is that our company tax rates are still high, much above the OECD averages of 24.9%. So the 27.5% is too high to be increasing significantly the amount of trade and investment. Foreign investment, companies overseas aren't investing in Australia very prevalently because we've still got those high rates compared to a lot of our Asian neighbours in particular. That's one potential weakness because that will lead to a lack of jobs because of the lack of foreign investment. We still rely too heavily on direct taxes, so even though we're trying to reform it and try and put more taxes on indirect taxes, there's still high levels of direct taxes, which is discouraging investment and discouraging participation. Some of these policies aren't getting through the Senate, to the upper house, because they can't get the votes, which is making them less effective. They can also conflict some of these taxation reforms with equity. So the idea is that some of these taxation reforms promote efficiency, but if we're placing the taxes on indirect tax and taking away from direct taxes, that can have negative impacts on equity. Other things, there's little evidence that lower personal incomes have actually boosted efficiency. So some people argue that the higher tax rates often force people to work harder. So when we lower income tax rates, some middle and high income earners, rather than working harder because they get to keep more of their money, they're basically using that as an excuse to work less hours because they don't have to work as many hours because they're getting to keep more of their money anyway. So you could argue that it's having the opposite effect that they'd like to because people aren't working as much because they get to keep more of their income. Other problems is that a lot of these tax cuts, like the accelerated depreciation allowances, the cutting of the company tax rate, they could potentially lead to bigger structural budget deficits. Well, they are leading to bigger structural budget deficits because it's meaning the government's not collecting as much tax, and that can have negative implications for the government's ability to provide public goods, infrastructure and education, etc. Last things last, and we want to make sure that these tax reforms don't hurt the budget, so that we should only reduce taxes that are hurting effort and growth. If we reduce too many taxes, it can have a negative impact on our budget. Just lastly, just one question that you may come across. It talks about why a less progressive tax system might be associated with an increase in efficiency. So the idea here is you need to be able to define what a less progressive tax system means. So it means that marginal tax rates are not going up as fast. So those earning less than $18,200 at the moment pay 0%. Those that own over $180,000 pay 45 cents. A less progressive tax system would mean that the marginal tax rate does not climb as steeply, or a higher income could be earned before the higher tax rate applies. So basically it's less disincentive for high income earners because of the high taxes they're going to pay. Just be mindful that if you are defining progressive taxes, make sure you say that it's the rate that increases the more that you earn. Both sides of Parliament would argue that reducing the progressivity of income taxes helps to boost productivity, because by lowering marginal tax rates there's a greater incentive to work and provide effort in the workplace, particularly if wages are tied to productivity. So if people get to keep more of their income, then that is likely to boost technical efficiency and lead to more goods being produced. In terms of why a less progressive tax system can improve efficiency, you could also talk about the labour market. So when there's a less progressive tax system, the relative wages between high and low income professions may be smaller. So there's more incentive, for example, to become a doctor because you're going to get to keep more of your income, and that's good for allocative efficiency because people are putting their resources to where they're best suited or where their skills are being maximised.